Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents An Only Child and Her Sister, a Memoir, by Maxwell Clair. Narrated by Donna Postel. Chapter 1. I got married when I was 13 years old. People are understandably shocked when they hear this, and always ask, why in the world did you get married at 13? And I always answer, I don't know, I guess the right guy just hadn't come along till then. The year was 1962. It was a small affair, just the groom, myself, and my mother. The wedding was held in the absolute very best corrugated aluminum structure in all of Ensenada, Mexico. The ceremony, and I use the word loosely, lasted a little over 8 minutes, and we were all back home in Los Angeles the same night. Throughout my life, I've usually been the one to deliver the news that I was pregnant and married only a few short months after formally entering my teens. People always have a hard time believing I'm from a big city like Los Angeles, California. The assumption is that I must have been raised in a polygamous sect hidden in the wilds of Utah, or barring that, misspent my youth somewhere south of the Mason-Dixon line. I've heard myself referred to as the Loretta Lynn of Sherman Oaks on more than one occasion. These days, it's not quite as shocking to hear about a 13-year-old getting in the family way. But in 1962, trust me, I was the first on my block. Because it was such a shameful and embarrassing story, and I'd had so many horrible reactions to it over the years, I learned to tell it on myself right away, in order to give people a chance to retreat if they couldn't handle it. I suppose it was a little like quitting before you're fired. These days, I've found a much happier balance. I don't feel I have to confess my life story to every person I come in contact with. But for many years, if anyone asked how I was doing, whether it was the checkout clerk at the market or the ticket taker at the movies, I would feel compelled to joke that I was doing okay for someone who got married in the 8th grade. And if we got past the first question, the next question was invariably, why on earth would your parents allow you to get married that young? The answer to that one always gets 'em. It was my mother's idea. By late December 1962, I was 13 and a half years old and had been sick with the stomach flu for a few weeks. I would throw up in the morning, and then I'd feel okay the rest of the day. One morning, as I was coming out of the bathroom after a particularly vocal concert at the bowl, as my mother phrased it, she called me into the living room and told me to sit down. That instantly made me nervous. My mother wasn't the kind of woman to initiate a heart-to-heart with me. We didn't even like each other much at this point. In fact, I had run away for over 2 weeks with my 18-year-old boyfriend, Don, but that had been almost 3 months earlier. My mother lit a cigarette and took a deep drag. I took one of her cigarettes from the pack and lit up along with her. I had been smoking, with her permission, for about a year at this point. How could that be? Well, when I was 11, she had caught me with a cigarette, but instead of promising never to do it again, I made a passionate case for why I should be allowed to indulge in the habit. You know, Mom, I don't even really like cigarettes, I told her. I think the biggest reason that I want to smoke is that it's forbidden. If I were allowed to smoke, I bet I'd lose interest in the whole idea. After all, I went on, you allow me to swear and say fuck whenever I want, but I hardly ever do. It was true. I'd realized, at about age 8, that from the first time I tried swearing, I got no reaction from my mother or my father, and it had soon lost its appeal. Mom was very impressed with my logic, and even more impressed that I had the guts to try to run a scam on her. It was a dangerous game, with few survivors. But at age 12, I had gotten into the ring with her, and she had agreed to let me smoke. Her only rule was that I had to buy my own. But here I was a year later, still smoking, and smoking one of her cigarettes. And she wasn't mad. Clearly, something was very wrong. after a few awkward moments of each of us puffing away, she broke the news. "You're pregnant." Pregnant? She might as well be telling me that I was the Empress of China. That's how unbelievable this was for me to hear. How could I be pregnant? Mom sighed and took another drag on her cigarette. "Oh, please. We don't have to have that conversation, too, do we?" Not that we had ever had that conversation. Never once had my mother sat me down and, awkwardly or otherwise, spoken a word about what it meant to be a teenaged girl on her way to becoming a woman. Not that she was shy about such things. My mother, Eve Whitney, did not have a shy bone in her body. In her entire life, I don't think she ever experienced a moment of hesitation when it came to doing or saying whatever came into her mind. I never once saw my mother have what most people would call feelings of guilt. And as for maternal instincts, well, the truth is that my mother didn't like children, and I happened to be one at the time. Occasionally, I'll watch a documentary on PBS that shows a female tiger in the jungles of wherever, nursing a baby monkey, orphaned by the tiger just hours earlier. The tiger's maternal instinct is so strong that she is willing to nurture what would ordinarily be dinner. My mother somehow skipped that evolutionary link in the chain. And the truth is, everything in my life has been affected by that fact, whether I realized it at the time or not. "I'll take you to a doctor to make sure, but it sure looks to me like you're knocked up." Not an ounce of concern, not a whisper of compassion, not even anger or frustration. That would have at least been a sign that the two of us were connected somehow. No. This was simply information that I, at 13 years old, was somehow supposed to process and then come to a decision. No discussion about what that decision might mean to the rest of my life. And while such behavior might be understandable if my mother had been severely lacking in intelligence or education, such was not the case. Extremely smart, very well read, politically active, and up on all the latest news stories, my mother could hold her own in a conversation with anybody about anything. She simply didn't give a rat's ass about her daughters. Of course, I loved her madly. I didn't know I could do anything else. She was the only mother I had, and I longed for her approval, yearned for a kind word, dreamt of the day when she realized what a good little girl I was, and got down to the business of loving me back. Having found none of the above in the first 13 years of my life, I had turned to the first nice boy who had shown an interest in me. He was 18 years old, his name was Don, he bought me a hot dog, and, this was the clincher, he actually smiled and asked me how I was doing. Maybe it wasn't love at first sight, but it was more attention than I had received in years. And so, about 2 weeks later, I managed to convince my new best friend Don that the best possible idea in the whole wide world was for the two of us to run away together. Just get in his car and go. Whatever happened, I figured it couldn't be any worse than the life I was living. And besides, maybe if I just disappeared, then even my mother would have to take notice, right? "If you are pregnant," my mother said, lighting a new Winston with the remains of the one she was smoking, "then you basically have 3 choices. You can give it up for adoption, you can get an abortion, or you can get married." I'm pretty sure I didn't know the word surreal at the time, but surreal is absolutely the best word to describe the conversation I was having with my mother. The manner in which she listed my 3 options didn't imply that one choice was any better than another. True to form, her voice very clearly conveyed the message that it really didn't matter much to her which option I choose. She had better things to do than to be stuck having this conversation in the first place. In stunned silence, I looked around my mother's apartment. The water in the kitchen sink had a thick layer of grease riding atop the week's dirty dishes. Open containers of food were scattered along the counters. Cat droppings decorated the carpet, A half-dozen or so ashtrays were overflowing with spent butts. My mother's face glared at me with a familiar mix of impatience and annoyance, and all of a sudden, the idea of marriage landed on my newly adolescent brain like a butterfly, all bright colors and flights of freedom. Not that I had any real idea of what marriage meant, but if it would get me out of this apartment, away from the icy glare of my mother, then it sounded pretty good to me. My sister Chris had made her getaway the year before, spending most of her time ditching school and looking for trouble with a group of neighborhood bad boys, spending only the occasional night at the apartment when she needed a place to crash. And Chris was my younger sister by 15 months. "I'm going to take you to a doctor to be sure," said my mother again in her gravelly baritone from behind a cloud of smoke. "But I'm sure." How could she be sure? I wasn't even sure that what Don and I had had was real sex, so the idea of my being pregnant hadn't even entered my mind. But if I knew precious little about such matters, I knew that my mother was well-versed. Many was the night she had entertained a friend in her bedroom, one thin wall away from mine. I knew the sounds, the rhythms of sex, but none of the particulars. But Mom was saying I was pregnant, so what was I going to do? One more look around the apartment, my eyes coming to rest on my mother's look of impatience. "I want to get married," I said meekly. "Fine," she said. And then, nonchalantly, "Are you sure that what's-his-name is the father?" Could this be any more humiliating? "Don's the only one," I managed to answer. "Good, that makes it easier," she replied. Mom took me to the doctor that day, and he confirmed that I was 3 months pregnant. She wanted to meet with Don's parents right away. Don and I hadn't talked much since we'd returned from our 2 weeks on the run, and he didn't yet know that I was pregnant. Here's the sad truth. I didn't even know where the father of my baby lived. After we had met at North Hollywood Park, Don would come over and keep me company during those many days and nights that my mother was either working or out on a date. And keeping me company is pretty much how I got pregnant. Mom threatened to call Don if I didn't, so I made the call, and a short time later we were sitting in Don's spotless, perfectly ordered living room, facing his folks. His mother, Elsie, was a thin, tense, hand-wringing ball of anxiety. His father, Don Sr., a quiet and stoic man. It was a weekend, and yet his dad was wearing a tie with a cardigan sweater buttoned up, just like Ozzie Nelson on the Ozzie and Harriet show. My mother got right to the point. She told them that I was pregnant, and that Don was the father, and that we needed to get married right away. Don went pale. His father cleared his throat. His mother let out an involuntary shriek, and then called my mother crazy. She said I was trying to ruin Don's life. Don Sr. tried to remain calm and reason with my mother. His son had just graduated from high school and was supposed to be starting classes at USC very soon. He couldn't just let his son get married and destroy his life. Surely there must be another alternative. Mom shrugged, and we stood to leave. "I can think of one," she said. "I could have your precious little son arrested for statutory rape. He was an 18-year-old, taking a 13-year-old across state lines. How's that for ruining his life?" And just like that, they saw things her way. Chapter 2. There are no excuses for my mother's behavior during my childhood, but there are, perhaps, reasons. Her own childhood was a nightmare of secrets and lies. Eve Whitney grew up in Denver, Colorado, with her sister Margaret, who was 3 years older. They lived with their father, Joe, a weak and ineffectual man, and their domineering grandmother, Grandma Whitney. The girls were told that their mother had died when they were younger, but they weren't given any of the details. just that they should be glad she was out of their lives. When Eve and Margaret were 7 and 10, Grandma Whitney told them they were too much to handle and sent them off to live in an orphanage run by a Catholic order of nuns. It was not an easy life for Eve. She was a spirited and scrappy kid, and the convent was not a place that honored that kind of spunk and individuality. When Chris and I were growing up, Mom loved to tell us horror stories about the cruelties she suffered at the hands of the nuns. She was beaten, deprived, neglected, always hungry, and repeatedly shamed. She was never hugged or kissed as a kid, and as a consequence, she was very uncomfortable with any kind of touching or affection. Eve frequently ran away and would just show up at her father and grandmother's house, begging them to let her stay. But they would just pack her right back off to the convent, and then she would be punished all the more for having run away. For reasons I never learned, Eve's sister Margaret was allowed to return home. As a result of my mother's mistreatment at the hands of the Catholic Church, she grew up hating the Catholic religion and everything to do with it. And even though it wasn't Margaret's fault that she was allowed to leave the convent while Eve wasn't, Eve grew up disliking her sister as well. But instead of simply dealing with her pain and her disappointment, Eve developed a strange pride about having gotten through that rough part of her childhood. She felt that it had toughened her up, and tough, for Eve, was a damn good thing. When she was 14 years old, Eve got news that would change her life forever. Still living in the convent/orphanage, she was told that her Grandma Whitney had died. It wasn't that Eve would miss the old bitch, because she wouldn't, but news of the woman's death had brought an unusual visitor. A woman named Rilla showed up at the convent, claiming to be Eve's mother. She calmly told Eve that she was there to take Eve, as well as her sister Margaret, to live in California. Eve's initial shock was replaced by skepticism. She knew her mother was dead. She had always known it. So who was this person, and why would she want to take Eve anywhere? Up until now, no one had wanted her. No one had showed the least interest in her life, including her own father. This well-dressed woman, who wore her dark hair in a stylish wave, seemed sophisticated, worldly. At 14, Eve was a skinny kid with big brown eyes and mousy hair pulled into braids. Eve scanned the woman, searching for similarities, but she didn't see much resemblance, and didn't believe that this could really be her mother. But in the end, she didn't care who the hell this woman was. She looked like more fun than the nuns, and leaving this place with a complete stranger was a damn sight more appealing than staying here with people who beat her and humiliated her in the name of Jesus. "I'll get my sweater," she told the woman. And as simple as that, Rilla, Eve, and Margaret drove to California. According to my mother, Rilla was completely unapologetic about her long absence. Rilla told the girls their father had been a worthless mama's boy, and that the only thing he ever did that took any balls at all was to marry her and have 2 kids. But Rilla and Grandma Whitney had battled constantly over who would boss Joe around the rest of his life, and Grandma Whitney had won. She'd offered Rilla $2,000 cash as an incentive to leave town, and Rilla had taken it. Rilla told her daughters that she believed she had done them a favor by leaving them, because she wasn't much good with kids. But now Grandma Whitney was dead, and the girls weren't kids anymore, so she thought it was time to come and get them. End of discussion. Eve and Margaret could either accept Rilla's story without a word of protest, or go back to their former accommodations at Our Lady of Pain and Suffering. Their new home was a modest little bungalow in Gardena, California, where Rilla lived with her common-law husband, Tony, a bald man with a fat cigar and a big smile. Rilla turned out to be quite a flamboyant and edgy character. She and Tony had run a speakeasy in the late 1920s and early 1930s, until Prohibition ended. Now, Uncle Tony, as the girls were told to call him, bet the ponies all day, and Rilla had a little beauty parlor in town. Rilla and Tony were raucous and fun, unless they'd been drinking too much, which was often, and then Rilla was loud and Tony was mean. They fought big, and several of their battles ended with one of them in the hospital. The warfare between Rilla and Tony was contagious. The girls were glad to be away from their old life, but not happy to be sharing time or a room. One big bone of contention was that Eve was in awe of Rilla and admired her spunk and individuality, while Margaret was much less enamored. In fact, Margaret was becoming more and more resentful of the fact that Rilla had abandoned them in the first place. Eve and Margaret battled constantly, just as Eve, years later, seemed to enjoy it when my sister Chris and I were at each other's throats. Rilla encouraged the fights between her two daughters. What a lovely family tradition to initiate. By the time my mother was 16, she had filled out in all the right places and had grown into a traffic-stopping beauty. Tony was still gambling for a living and not doing very well, and Rilla had grown tired of running a beauty parlor. Rilla recognized an opportunity when she saw one, and she took Eve to a photographer friend and had some shots taken. Soon Eve was getting modeling work and helping out with the bills. Things went so well that Rilla thought Eve should try it full-time and encouraged her daughter to quit school. Rilla acted as Eve's manager, and by the time Eve was 18, she had landed a contract at MGM Studios. That meant she'd be getting a steady paycheck from now on, so Rilla sold her salon, and it fell to Eve to support the household. It was the early 1940s, and musicals were popular. Big productions, casts of hundreds. This was a good time for Eve to be under contract at the studio. It almost guaranteed that she would get cast in small parts in the dozens of movies that MGM was cranking out back then. There was always a demand for beautiful girls to decorate the background of those big, glitzy production numbers, and Eve worked constantly. It was all new and very exciting to her. She was meeting important people and beginning to date a variety of men. Rilla controlled that part of Eve's life as well, giving her heartfelt, albeit unsavory, advice on how to get gifts and money out of men. Once, when Eve was invited to spend a weekend on a yacht with a much older man, Rilla instructed Eve to say that she couldn't go because she'd miss out on several $100s worth of film work. Of course, the man offered to reimburse Eve for her lost income. Next, Rilla told her to tell him that she had nothing suitable to wear for such a glamorous weekend. As Rilla predicted, the man offered to send a check and a car so Eve could go shopping. I'm sure that Rilla would describe what she was doing as career advice. I think the phrase pimping your daughter out is a more accurate term. If Eve developed a thick skin and a cynical attitude about the world in general, and men in particular, perhaps she had cause. What always surprised me was the sincere admiration in which Eve held this woman who called herself Mother. Whenever she would tell me stories about Rilla, she never failed to say how much she respected the woman. Once, when I was an adult myself, I asked her just what the hell she admired so much about a woman who had abandoned her until she was 14, and then practically turned her out as a prostitute. My mother said she liked Rilla's gumption and outspokenness. She took pride in the fact that Rilla had been a tough broad who didn't take shit from anybody. Not exactly the all-American definition of mother that most girls grew up with in the 50s and 60s. And so it came to pass that Eve Whitney ended up being one tough and outspoken broad who never took shit from anybody. Trust me, it's overrated. Over the next few years, Eve appeared in dozens of movies. Ziegfeld Follies, Du Barry Was a Lady, Joan of Arc. She became what was then known as a petty girl. George Petty was an artist who was famous for his illustrated pin-up girls of the 1940s. There was even a movie made about him in 1950 called The Petty Girl, starring Robert Cummings. Eve also posed for Vargas and was Miss January in a Vargas calendar for the War Effort edition in 1942. One of the duties of a showgirl under contract to the studios was to serve coffee to the servicemen at the Hollywood Canteen, a diner near the studios that was opened by Betty Davis and John Garfield during the war. And that's where my mother met my father. My father, Eddie Maxwell Chirkos, was born and raised in Detroit by his mother, Mimi. Eddie never knew his father, who had died of pneumonia a few months before my dad was born. As a result of that loss, his mother was extremely overprotective of him as a child. Luckily for my grandmother's nerves, from the time my father could form a sentence, all he ever wanted to be was a writer. Not a terribly dangerous pastime for a child. He wrote songs and plays and performed them for his family. His aunts, uncles, and grandfather were a great audience for young Eddie, and they encouraged his creative side. At age 12, one of his songs was published in the local newspaper, and he officially became a paid writer. When Eddie was old enough to leave home, he made his way out to Hollywood to break into the entertainment business as a song and gag writer. L.A. in the 1940s was a magical place. For the lucky and the talented, it was a town filled with opportunity. Eddie got a small apartment in Hollywood with maid service for $6 a week. He did his homework and found out that many actors, agents, managers, and producers lunched daily at the famous Brown Derby restaurant in Hollywood. My dad went there every day for a month and had himself paged to the telephone. It seems corny now, the stuff of sitcoms, but back then Hollywood was a touch more innocent, and pranks like that actually worked. His ingenuity finally paid off when he landed an interview with an agent who remarked, "Good to meet you, Eddie. I've been hearing your name around town." Soon my dad was working steadily, writing gags for the comedy singing quartet, the Yacht Club Boys. Eddie was paid $25 a week to write jokes for them. They all worked in a hotel room at the famed Garden of Allah in Hollywood. The group was staying there while they worked on Pigskin Parade at 20th Century Fox with Judy Garland. After that, my father was signed by Fox to write material for the Ritz Brothers picture, On the Avenue. He also worked at MGM, Republic, and Paramount, where he wrote songs for many of the Gene Autry and Roy Rogers pictures. Eddie's next job as a writer came when he enlisted in the Army in 1942. He was assigned to the newly formed FMPU, which stood for First Motion Picture Unit, also known by its acronym FMPU. The unit was formed to produce training and propaganda films for American servicemen. The first FMPU production, Winning Your Wings, is credited with generating 150,000 new recruits. The unit was stationed at Hal Roach Studios in Culver City, California, known affectionately at the time as Fort Roach. Though most of the group were exempt from basic training, the soldiers were still required to sleep at the studio, and so several sound stages were converted to barracks with rows and rows of army cots. Some of the famous people in the movie unit at that time were Ronald Reagan, Frank Capra, Clark Gable, Jimmy Stewart, John Huston, George Reeves, William Holden, Alan Ladd, and Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss. My father got to know them all and had marvelous stories to tell when I was growing up. When I was little, I asked my father if he had ever done anything heroic during the war. He responded that he had been awarded the typewriter ribbon for crossing Washington Boulevard against a red light. My dad was a handsome and dashing figure in his studio-tailored Army uniform. With his dark hair and trim mustache, he looked like a cross between Clark Gable and Errol Flynn. One night, my dad and some of his Army buddies went to the Hollywood canteen for a couple of beers, and that's where he first saw Eve.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?